How tricky is patient confidentiality? Very, very tricky. And it's tricky for a number of reasons. It's tricky because patients share with us information which is intimate, which is important to their lives and their well-being, which could affect things like their personal insurance. It's tricky because at the very time that we have this privileged information, there are lots of other people who have claims to need to know that information to have it shared with them. Relatives, other clinicians, social services, the police on occasion may all want or think they have a right to know the information which has been gifted to you by the patient. It's tricky because under difficult, fraught clinical circumstances where the pressure of time applies, you have to make decisions as to whether you will share that information or whether you go back to the patient and ask for more permission to share particular pieces. The legislation that underpins patient confidentiality comes from 4 or 5 different sources. And because of that, within the article associated with this module, we cover the general outline of that and offer a table which sort of puts the key points that come from each of those places. What's important for the nurse and for you studying this particular module is that you look at those particular sources as we've summarised them, and you link them to the local clinical governance policies of the trust or organisation you work for. It's within that local policy that you should be searching out and seeing whether all those sources are recognised and whether they are clear. Because if they're not, it's an important issue to raise the concern with your employer and with your manager so that that can be rectified. The legislation comes from different sources, but at base, it follows the principle that patients have the right to control the use of the information about them. There are some circumstances where that won't apply, and one of those is covered by the Mental Capacity Act of 2005. There can be circumstances, for example, when a patient is suffering from dementia, where they may not have the mental capacity to give permission for you to share information with others. Under those circumstances, you will have to go back and check carefully, both with the guardian of the patient, their next of kin, and with fellow clinicians as to when you can share particular pieces of information. So it's not straightforward. There are multiple pieces of legislation. They need to be brought together in the local governance policies, and this article associated with this module should help you to do that. What is the purpose of this module? Well, the purpose of this module is severalfold. First of all, I want to convey to you the key difference between privacy and confidentiality. It might seem obvious, but in fact, the two are often confused. Privacy concerns the person, P with P. Privacy is about how much we inquire into the circumstances of the person and what they're doing, what health risks they're suffering from, what problems they're having. So privacy is about intrusion and how much we should inquire of the patient. Now clearly there are lots of circumstances where we need to inquire quite deeply into the circumstances of patients. We can't avoid doing that, but we have to act tactfully. So that's the issue of privacy. Confidentiality is different. Confidentiality is to do with confidences. C goes with C. Confidentiality, confidences. And it's the case that when the patient has given us information, we have to consider how we handle that, who we share it with, how it's conveyed, how it's stored, how it's recorded, and how it's protected on behalf of the patient who has gifted it to us. So confidentiality is about what we do with the information they share, and privacy is to do with how we inquire into the circumstances of people. So that's the first and important thing to take into account. The second thing to take into account is the issue of what we do with information, the decisions we have to make. There are a variety of circumstances where we may have to break the principle that the patient controls the information that is shared. Deciding when and how and where we do that is something that we want to cover with you during the course of this module and is covered within the article that supports it. One example of a circumstance where you may have to break the principle of confidentiality is where a parent has potentially abused a child. So here's a circumstance where a child presents to you with bruises up and down their arms, and the parent says to you, I don't wish this information to be shared with anybody else. I am the guardian of the child, and I will determine where that information goes. So there are some circumstances where the nurse is in an uncomfortable position, particularly in acute circumstances in casualties and in similar departments, where you have to make a decision to break the confidentiality of the patient or their legal guardian. And that would be an example where the patient is at risk, where they're vulnerable, either as a child or as an adult. There may be circumstances where you need to break confidentiality. So the module helps you to think about this business of keeping and breaking confidences. What key principles are involved in sharing information? Well, I think the first principle to remember is that you work with patient dignity. If you were the patient, would you wish this information to be shared with somebody else? Equally important, would you wish the information to be shared widely or only with certain people? Would you be happy for it to be shared with other clinicians in the immediate team? Would you be happy for it to be shared with social services? Would you be happy for it to be included in information about you as part of a particular research project? So the principle, you start with dignity. You start with what you understand the patient might wish to control about their information, and you go back and you check. There are circumstances whereby a policy may be written whereby certain basic information is shared and you get that permission from the patient to use that as part of their admission to hospital. But there are many others where you really need to go back to check with the patient that they're happy, particularly if their circumstances change. So that's the first important principle. And that first important principle applies to patients whether they're alive or whether they're dead. A dead patient has confidentiality rights as much as a live patient, so that's important to remember. I think the second principle then is to remember that once you have that information, you do have to work consciously and carefully to check whether you are following the legislation, the policies which have been written on information governance where you work. It's important to go back and check why you are or are not considering sharing that information with a third person. The police may wish to know. A reporter from the local newspaper will wish to know. There may be a temptation for others to ask about it on social media, but they do not necessarily have a right to know the information. So understanding why particular legislation influences whether you do or don't share the information is an important underpinning. By understanding that through the article that I've written and which I share with you, you should be able to go back and start thinking about encounters, circumstances that you have met and where the decisions seem particularly difficult. I sincerely hope that you will find that by looking at the legislation we cover in the article and by thinking about these things afresh, particularly the business of confidentiality versus privacy, that you will find that you can tackle this subject a little bit more clearly and a little bit more confidently. It's never easy. It's never easy for you to face these requests for information under difficult circumstances. But thinking about it carefully now will stand you in good stead for the future. And I wish you every success with that, because I know it's never, never easy.